Franz Mehring, Karl Marx, The Story of His Life. Chapter 1, Early Years. 1. Home and School. Karl Heinrich Marx was born on the 5th of May, 1818, in Trier. Owing to the confusion and destruction amongst the official registers in the Rhineland during the troubled times which prevailed at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th centuries, little is known with certainty about his antecedents. Even the year in which Heinrich Heine was born is still the subject of dispute. With regard to Karl Marx, however, the situation is not quite so bad, for he was born in more peaceable times. But when a sister of his father died about 50 years ago, leaving an invalid will, all the legal investigations to ascertain the lawful heirs were not able to discover the birth and death dates of her parents, that is to say, of the grandparents of Karl Marx. His grandfather was Marx Levi, but later on the Levi was dropped. This man was a rabbi in Trier and is believed to have died in 1798. In any case, he was no longer alive in 1810, but his wife Eva Marx, née Moses, was, and she is believed to have died in 1825. This pair had numerous children, and two of them, Samuel and Herschel, devoted themselves to scholarly professions. Samuel, who was born in 1781 and died in 1829, became the successor of his father as rabbi in Trier. Herschel, the father of Karl Marx, was born in 1782. He studied jurisprudence and became an advocate in Trier. Later he became a Justizrat, and in 1824 he adopted Christianity, taking the name Heinrich Marx. He died in 1838. Heinrich Marx married a Dutch Jewess named Henrietta Pressburg, whose genealogical tree showed, according to the statement of her granddaughter Eleanor Marx, a century-long line of rabbis. Henrietta Pressburg died in 1863. Heinrich Marx and his wife Henrietta left a large family, but at the time of the testamentary investigations which provided us with these genealogical notes, only 4 of the children were still alive. Karl Marx, Sophie the widow of an advocate named Schmalhausen in Maastricht, Emily the wife of an engineer named Conradi in Trier, and Louise the wife of a merchant named Juter in Cape Town. Thanks to his parents, whose marriage was an extremely happy one, Karl Marx, next to his sister Sophie the eldest child, enjoyed a cheerful and carefree youth. His splendid natural gifts awakened in his father the hope that they would one day be used in the service of humanity, whilst his mother declared him to be a child of fortune in whose hands everything would go well. However, Karl Marx was neither the son of his mother, like Goethe, nor the son of his father like Lessing and Schiller. With all her affectionate care for her husband and her children, Marx's mother was completely absorbed in her domestic affairs. All her life she spoke broken German and took no part in the intellectual struggles of her son, beyond perhaps wondering with a mother's regret what might have become of him had he taken the right path. In later years Karl Marx appears to have been on intimate terms with his maternal relatives in Holland, and in particular with his uncle Philips. He repeatedly refers in terms of great friendship to this fine old boy who proved helpful to him later on in the material troubles of his life. Although Karl Marx's father died a few days after his son's 20th birthday, he too seems to have observed with secret apprehension the demon in his favorite son. It was not the petty and fidgety anxiety of a parent for his son's career which troubled him, but rather the vague feeling that there was something as hard as granite in his son's character, something entirely foreign to his own yielding nature. As a Jew, a Rhinelander and a lawyer, he should have been thrice armed against the wiles of the East Helbian Junkers, but in fact Heinrich Marx was a Prussian patriot, though not in the wretched sense the term has today, but a Prussian patriot of the Waldeck-and-Ziegler type, saturated with bourgeois culture and having an honest belief in the old Fritzian Enlightenment, an ideologue of the type hated by Napoleon with good reason. Although the conqueror had given to the Rhenish Jews equality of civil rights and to the Rhineland itself the Code Napoleon, a jealously guarded treasure ceaselessly attacked by the old Prussian reaction, Marx's father hated Napoleon. His belief in the genius of the Prussian monarchy was not even shaken by the fact that the Prussian government would have compelled him to change his religion in order to save his bourgeois position. This has often been cited, even by otherwise well-informed persons, apparently for the purpose of justifying or at least excusing an action which requires neither justification nor excuse. Even considered from a purely religious standpoint, a man who acknowledged a pure belief in God with Locke, Leibniz and Lessing no longer had any place in the synagogue and belonged rather in the fold of the Prussian state church, in which at that time a tolerant rationalism prevailed. a so-called religion of reason which had left its mark even on the Prussian censorship edict of 1819. At that time the renunciation of Judaism was not merely an act of religious emancipation, but also, and even more so, an act of social emancipation. The Jewish community as such had taken no part whatever in the great intellectual labors of the German thinkers and poets. The modest light of Moses Mendelssohn had vainly attempted to guide his nation into the intellectual life of Germany. And just at the time when Heinrich Marx decided to adopt Christianity, a circle of young Jews in Berlin revived Mendelssohn's efforts only to meet with the same failure. Although such men as Eduard Gans and Heinrich Heine were in their ranks, Gans, who was the helmsman of the venture, was the first to strike his flag and go over to Christianity. Heinrich Heine hurled a robust curse after him: Gestern noch ein Held gewesen, ist man heute schon ein Schurke. But it was not long before Heine himself was compelled to follow his example and purchase an entrance card into the community of European culture. Both Gans and Heine contributed their historic share to the intellectual labors of the century in Germany. Whilst the names of their companions who remained loyal to the cultural development of Judaism have long since been forgotten, thus for many a decade the adoption of Christianity was an act of civilized progress for the freer spirits of Judaism. And the change of religion made by Heinrich Marx for himself and his family in 1824 must be understood in this sense and no other. It is possible that external circumstances determined the moment at which the change was made, but they were certainly not the cause. The breaking up of estates and farms by Jewish usurers took place on a growing scale during the agricultural crisis in the 20s, and as a result it produced a violent wave of anti-Semitism in the Rhineland. In this situation it was not the duty of a man of irreproachable honesty like Marx's father to bear any share of this hatred, and, having regard for his children, he would have had no right to do so. Perhaps the death of his mother, which occurred at about this time, freed him from considerations of filial piety, feelings which would have been in harmony with his whole character. Or perhaps the fact that the eldest son came of school age the year the father changed his religion may have played a part in the final decision. But whether this was the case or not, there can be no doubt that Heinrich Marx had attained that humanistic culture which freed him entirely from all Jewish prejudices. And he handed on this freedom to his son Karl as a valuable heritage. There is nothing in the numerous letters Heinrich Marx wrote to his student son which betrays a trace of any specifically Jewish traits, either good or bad. His letters are written in an old-fashioned fatherly, sentimental and rambling way, and in the style prevailing in 18th-century correspondence, when a true German gushed in love and blustered in anger. Without any trace of petty bourgeois narrow-mindedness, the letters readily enter into the intellectual interests of the son whilst showing a decisive and thoroughly justifiable objection to the latter's hankerings after fame as a common poetaster. But with all his delight in the thoughts of his son's future, the old man, with his hair blanched and his spirit a little subdued, cannot quite rid himself of the idea that perhaps his son's heart is not as great as his brain, and that perhaps it will not find room enough for those mundane but milder feelings which are so very consoling in this human vale of tears. In this sense his doubts were probably justified. The real love which he bore for his son in the depths of his heart did not make him blind, but rather prophetic. But as no man can ever foresee the final consequences of his actions, so Heinrich Marx did not think and could not have thought that the rich store of bourgeois culture which he handed on to his son Karl as a valuable heritage for life would only help to deliver the demon he feared, not knowing whether it was heavenly or Faustian. Whilst still in the house of his parents, Karl Marx surmounted with the greatest ease things which cost Heine and Lassalle the first great struggles of their lives and left them with wounds from which neither of them ever fully recovered. It is not so easy to see what school life contributed to the development of the growing lad. Karl Marx never spoke of any of his school companions, and none of them has left any information about him. He soon completed the curriculum of his high school in Trier, and his leaving certificate is dated the 25th of August, 1835. It sends off the hopeful youth in the usual fashion with an expression of good wishes for his further progress and stereotyped observations concerning his attainments in the various subjects. However, it stresses in particular the fact that Karl Marx was often able to render and interpret the most difficult passages in the classics, and in particular such passages where the difficulty lay less in the peculiarities of the language than in the subject matter and the relation of ideas. His Latin themes, it declares, showed richness of thought and a deep acquaintance with their subject, but were often overweighted with unsuitable matter. In the actual finals religion presented some difficulties and history also, but in his German composition the examining masters found an interesting idea. An idea in fact which we shall find of much greater interest. The subject set was the reflections of a youth before choosing a profession, and the verdict on Marx's attempt was that it recommended itself by a richness of ideas and good systematic construction, but that otherwise its author fell into his usual error of exaggerated searchings after unusual and picturesque expressions. And then the following passage is quoted literally: "We cannot always take up the profession for which we feel ourselves suited. Our relations in society have begun to crystallize more or less before we are in a position to determine them." Thus the first flash of an idea shows itself like summer lightning in the mind of the lad, an idea the development and completion of which was to be the immortal service of the man.